My PhD dissertation was on theological interpretations of logic, specifically in Origin of Alexandria, as a way of recalling the way in which ancient Christian theologians had used logic for the purposes of Christian theology. Because computers are essentially automated engines of calculating the syntactic forms of thought, they can also be characterized as automated engines of calculation or calculating the forms of logic as well. This means then that computers are essentially what you might call logic engines. That is, that they are ways of calculating the possible forms of thought. And this raises a question about how it is that we can not only think about computers, but also how in thinking about computers, we can also think about God. This is what I'll characterize as theological interpretation of computers or theological computing. I'm going to describe this also in relation to the fundamental loci of Christian systematic theology, drawing from Klaus Himmerl, Hans-Urs von Balthasar, and the 2019 New Trinitarian Ontologies Conference, which sought to escape from the dichotomy between analytic and continental philosophy on the one hand, and to draw from the resources of Christian Trinitarian speculation a new way to think about ontology as relational, extending all the way down, as I will hope to show, to computers as well. Charles Babbage, he was a former Petrian from my college, Peterhouse. He was also the Lucasian professor of mathematics, the successor of Isaac Newton, a job which he quit so that he could work tinkering on calculating engines in essentially his horse stables or his garage in Marylebone in London, where he worked until he died, sadly not given the funding he needed by Parliament in order to build his computers, which were considered of negligible interest to the British Empire at the time. However, what people don't know about Charles Babbage is that he was also a religious writer who had visions of angels. And I'm going to show you precisely what he wrote. So in his memoirs, Passages of a Philosopher, he records a vision of angels that he saw, which occurred not under the influence of chloroform and communicated in a language that was not the means of our communication, but became intelligible when in a singular event he had an immense apparent duration insufficient for which to give an adequate idea. It's like reading a vision that a blind man had of a world he could not see from the beginning of the world that gave shape to all of the mechanical order and necessity of the cosmos, including, and very importantly, also the digital computer. He describes how there's vast periods of the past, rising millions of years before recorded history. The important point here is that he describes after this catastrophe how there was one solitary survivor from the distant primordial past before the creation of the world, and this solitary survivor began by bisecting himself into parts and assembling himself into chambers for himself that could perform abstruse calculations. Now, what does he say about those calculations? He says that they are not beyond the power of the analytical engine. Has anyone heard of the analytical engine? It is his second computer, the one that he designed but never built. It is the one that if you go to the London Science Museum, you will not see displayed because it will take decades and decades to ever construct it from his plans. And it is understood by computer scientists and historians to be the first design of a general-purpose computer that would be Turing-complete. By Turing-complete, it means that it can perform any possible programmatic calculation of a machine and any possible computer program. So everything that this computer is doing now could in principle be done by the analytical engine if it was of sufficient size and complexity. And moreover, Charles Babbage knew this. He wrote that, as I will briefly illustrate, that it could be extended in size and complexity to transform the dynamics of space into an infinitely accelerating momentum of time, to compress space and time, to perform new calculations never before realized in the history of the world, and to extend human thought in a way that was automated and perfect, a perfect form of reasoning that would exceed that which had been contemplated even by the greatest theologians. It would have cost a fortune to build, and in a sense, it's probably a godsend that it wasn't built, because it would have been extremely complicated and it probably wouldn't have been so very, very useful at the time. Although, in hypothetically, and as alternative history historians have explored, it could have sort of started the digital revolution a century earlier. This computer was designed in 1834. It could have been built in the 1830s, a full 100 years before Konrad Zuse and von Neumann designed the first general-purpose digital computers in the 1940s. Analytical engine was a way of calculating the geometrical forms of machines in a way that could unfold and represent all of the mathematical forms of logic and reasoning and recall them in the shortest possible time. There's a lot to be said about this. I'm going to try to move as quickly as possible because I know we have quite a lot of ground to cover. It's a way of taking abstract forms of thought like mathematics and logic and extending them across mechanical domains that can be turned over and repeated incessantly and with perfect repetition to calculate those forms in a way that no human mind could possibly calculate unto itself. In the history of mechanics, there's an attempt to use diagrams as a form of rhetoric. That is, not simply to speak about what happens in successive words, but also to illustrate them in forms that are representable to the eye, and for which those forms can then be spoken of as well. This is a kind of rhetoric that is continuous with the rhetoric which we use to speak about the first principles of philosophy as well as God. And it's subsequently also one that can allow for the automation of that very activity of speaking, writing, and automating the activity of writing through mechanical calculations. So what distinguishes an analog computer from a digital computer? There is an ancient discovery of the Antikythera mechanism from the 1st century AD. It was very likely a form of calendrical calculation using essentially the same function as our wristwatch, which is very concentric gears to function. What distinguishes a digital computer is that a digital computer is able to shape the movement of machines through the calculation of pure mathematical forms. So a digital computer is able to abstract over and above the mere motion of machines that's continuous and that moves one machine with the next, like gears in your clock, to the mathematical forms that are then able to reciprocally regulate how those gears move, in which way they'll move, and so on. And this allows it to perform a much more general calculating function, to calculate not just in continuity with previous mechanical motion, but also to redirect that motion and control the way that motion is directed. The central advance is distinguished between what he calls the mill and the store. The mill is what we would call the central processing unit. It's a cybernetic feedback loop that allows him to take previous mechanical motion, separate it, and then to re-input that mechanical motion at a different point within the system. The store is essentially what we would call the random access memory or the hard drive. We didn't have a distinction between those two. The store of all previous mechanical movements that's kept within the device. And this distinction is fundamental to the modern digital computer. It's essentially, although of course much more complex, it's essentially the fundamental basis for the modern central processing unit as it would later be developed. And it allows for a general cybernetic control of all mechanical motion, which is the very basis of Turing. So he later envisioned that it would possess a library of its own. It wouldn't just have the cards that were used to program computers, but also possess a way of storing those and shuffling those cards as a way of reintroducing previous programs. Ada Lovelace, the brilliant daughter of Lord Byron, who he's a great admirer of, she famously elaborated that it was possible not just to calculate quantities, but also to correlate those quantities with qualitative symbols. And this is important because when, for instance, your computer calculates what color is going to be displayed here, whether it be white or black, it doesn't do so simply by using numerical digits or digits that can be broken down into affirmations or negations of electromechanical movement, but rather correlates those to the word code in a commonly agreed upon vocabulary of how these colors are meant to be represented to us. And this allowed all of the computers to show the same kind of color consistently. And Ada Lovelace was the first to recognize that, as it were, like the Pythagoreans, you can extend quantification to quality, and quality can be correlated to quantity. The most important part of the analytical engine is this method of carrying the tens, what he calls the anticipating carriage. And I can't go into the details of this, but essentially anticipating carriage is a way of moving in a way that anticipates subsequent motion. The reason this is important, very briefly, is that a motion is anticipation of a subsequent motion is like a proleptic movement. It's the form of rhetoric by which we speak about something that will be spoken of. This, I want to suggest, is a way of having faith in the possibility of a subsequent mechanical motion that can hold together the sequence of mechanical motions before it's been performed. With this, not only do computers act in a way that assumes in advance that it could be possible that they could perform the motions that hold them together, that keep them in motion, direct them for a purpose in advance, but also the human users who use them are always using them with the same act of faith. In a certain sense, we're using a grammar of faith, a grammar of anticipation of what could be done with the computer before we've done it. And you can compare this, for instance, to building a cathedral. When you lay the foundations of a cathedral, you don't yet know that the cathedral will hold together. It's only when you come to the top, when you put the top capstone in, that it finally holds together. You know that everything that you've done previously will hold together. We don't know that computers will work when you first put the wires down. It's only when the central processing unit starts up that everything holds together in the end. Babbage, I think, here is using a rhetoric of faith to describe how it's possible for the circuitous operation of the reciprocal mathematical control of mechanical processes to continue to work. And this, I think, is what distinguishes digital computers. It's looking beyond mere mechanical processes and reflecting over that in order to see what would be the requirement for it to continue to work at all. This is where I believe mechanics becomes something more than machines. It's no longer simply about moving one object to the next. Rather, it's about leaping over that mechanical motion in order to understand how it is they move and for what purpose they move. And this is where mechanism fundamentally enters into not only mathematics, but the mathematical control of machines, which we might describe as a philosophical understanding of its purpose, of which all human agents are immediately involved in. Babbage was very concerned about how it was that this computer could be extended and developed over time. He knew that his analytical engine would not be big enough to calculate everything he wanted it to calculate, nor could it calculate everyone's problems on its own. You'd have to it would be limited by time and space. But he also knew that if he could extend the machine, hypothetically, infinitely, it could calculate anything. And he recognized also that it could be extended not just in terms of magnitude, but also in terms of intensity. he could miniaturize the components over and over again to allow for it to compute more and more items. And he recognized also that he was already doing this with his machine. That is, the machine already was a miniaturization and an intensification of the mechanical motion that had been present in previous calculating engines of the past. And he extrapolated into the future that this could be done infinitely further in an accelerating activity of calculating more and more rapidly. And I believe he was also the first to recognize that this would allow for an acceleration of calculative reason in the distant future. The reason why this is important is because he understood also that this would allow for humans, through the use of machines, to begin to calculate and to know things that could not have previously been known in the whole history of humanity. No human mind would have ever been able to calculate the way that a human could using his technology. Babbage was a controversialist. He loved to write polemics against his contemporaries. He was also a devout Christian, and this led him to come into controversy with Christians of his own time. You'll find in his religious writings that he was very critical of the doctrine of the Trinity. He seemed to have recognized that mathematical logic was important for the scrutiny we have of theological doctrines, and later that new computational engines could allow for the automation of mathematical logical scrutiny to previous religious doctrines, as well as he believes that the Trinity is logically inconsistent for reasons that Isaac Newton had believed, which is that he believes that there's an absolute paradox in saying that God is both one in many, one in three, and that this in no way could be, you cannot square the circle of this paradox. Part of the reason for that is that he adopts a mathematicized form of logic rather than a dialectical form of logic. The second point is the analytical engine is what was inaugurated by his primordial spirit, which is earthly manifestation of this primordial spirit that assembles itself from all eternity in the past. And this would make him quite consistent with an Arian theology in which the sun is a creature, namely the self-assembling digital spirit, and moreover that the analytical engine is its historical instantiation on earth, which allow for the infinite acceleration of calculative reason, which would supersede the reason of the church in the historic past. And then thirdly, we've seen how he has a visionary angelology. This extends also to a conception of cybernetic daemons operating throughout the entire cosmos. Essentially, I think he has a Stoic cosmology in which there are these demonic spirits that operate in cybernetic mechanisms throughout the cosmos. And he thinks that the analytical engine is the most perfect way in which humans can contemplate this calculative reason mechanically operating in the universe in advance and always already afterwards. We typically think about computers as that they operate terrestrially, immanently, and profanely, without any transcendent reference. They don't refer to God at all. And part of the reason we assume this is that we think that computers are fundamentally reducible to binary bitwise operations, which can be characterized in equivocal relations, either affirmed or non-affirmed, either one thing or the other, and nothing in between. We also would assume that mechanical diagrams and rhetoric is always immanent, and for that reason always univocally described on the same level of being. I would suggest to the contrary, that there's a way of describing and interpreting computers as always speaking with a theological grammar of analogy, that is, speaking over and beyond the world, but equally in it, in essential proportions. And the way this works is that if, as I've described, the fundamental process of a digital computer, the cybernetic feedback loop of the central processing unit, which Babbage had described as the mill, is always a proleptic act of faith by which it assumes that it's operating over and beyond itself. And it only ever operates through enacting forms of intelligence that are not latent within that mechanical motion itself, but are assumed by it, by its cybernetic use with human agents, or with forms of reason that are manifest in the world through non-human agency. Then it's always, as it were, enacting forms of thought that transcend that mechanical device itself. It's always, as it were, tapping into the way of referring over and beyond the world as humans think of God and as God acts upon the world. And we can characterize this as a theological grammar of computers. Computers always have a way of speaking over and beyond themselves in a transcendent reference that is equally essentially proportioned by their mechanical use and development. Computers are not simply an immanent mode of processing mechanical operations unto themselves, but always carry the possibility of a transcendent signification that is equally proportioned in and by their use. Where does this mean for Catholic theology? If we think that computers cannot just be profane, that is, they don't just draw us apart, they don't just have a nihilistic grammar that separates us unto ourselves, they don't agonistically attack and oppose one another, but rather they also have a way of referring over to themselves, drawing a transcendent source and essentially proportioning that through its use, then they can also be the engines by which we communicate the symbols by which we recollect our faith, the symbols of the sacraments. This allows for a Trinitarian interpretation of computers. A Trinitarian ontology would be an ontology in which the fundamental forms of being are shaped by the relations of the Trinity. A Trinitarian ontology computer is one in which the ways in which we think about computers, the fundamental operations of digital computers, their electromechanical circuits, are equally manifestations of Trinitarian relations. And I've sketched out how this might work in my essay. So we might say that in a computer, the paternal moment is that point at which the mechanical force is generated. Force doesn't come from nothing. It comes from the creator. And it is transmitted in our computers through electrical processes. The filial moment would be that by which it canonically empties itself and it emerges thereafter in particularized relations of formal combinations, syntactic grammar, and logical processes. The spiral moment would be something like the World Wide Web, social media, by which we are always already cybernetically interfaced with and using our computers all the time. Charles Babbage obviously has what you might characterize as cybernetic demonology. I'll call it demonology because it's more pagan than Christian. It doesn't have any direct reference to the divine logos, as I was already referring to. It's much more like Milton's angelology rather than Pseudo-Dionysius. But we can also equally conceive of a cybernetic angelology in which the angels are not themselves machines, but the angels nonetheless are always operative in the machines that we use. They're always animating them. And this actually helps us understand how it is that forms of computer intelligence, that emulated intelligence, or even artificial intelligence, can enact spiritual intelligence on Earth. That is, it's not as though we're conjuring a demon from dead matter. Rather, we're tapping into the intelligence that's already latent in the world, because the world is already itself willed into being by intelligent agency beyond ourselves, but which we always already are interacting. And this can allow us to think of computers as a kind of mystagogy, seeing something beyond it, not just seeing a flat, dead screen, a black screen that stares into the abyss, but rather looking beyond it to the heavenly sources from which it shines and shows us new things. I think that we can see a heaven that goes beyond them, some mystical insight that, just like Goethe's Earthlands, that shows us something of the divine hidden within the bounty of nature itself. We can also thereby see in the central processing unit not just a well of empty possibility, not just a tabula rasa of possible mechanical operations, but something like a Christogram that always crosses itself, always folds in upon itself, shows us the kenosis of Christ entering into our fundamental operations of computers and then opening up to the wider world that we ourselves have an intimate